Figure It Out by Jickas. Dazai woke up to a blinding white light. Was this what people meant when they said don't go towards the light? But then the light moved and blinded his right eye instead. He tried to move away from the offending light, but his body felt like lead. "Good response," a voice said. It was deep and a bit shaky. When the light moved away, he could see the old man. He was wearing a doctor's coat. Brain activity looks normal, reflexes are there, pupils dilated. Dazai tried to move. All he could do was turn his head a little. It seemed his body didn't want to cooperate just yet. "My name is Yato Igumi," the doctor said. "You're at Yokohama State Hospital. Take your time orientating yourself." The information was confusing. Not in a way that he didn't understand it, but in a way that didn't make sense. Why would he be at hospital? No, a state hospital. Mori would never allow that. The only conclusion was that this must be some sort of a trap. A strange one at that. He managed to straighten up a little to look at the doctor. He didn't seem menacing. He looked like any normal doctor. That part was actually confusing. There was no part of him that screamed danger. On the other hand, he looked pretty nice. But so did Hiroto, and he was a cold-blooded murderer. A nurse ran around the bed to help him sit up. He let her. "It seems the only damage was to your head," Yato said. "Do you know where you are?" That test Dazai could recognize anywhere. They were checking for brain injury. "Yokohama State Hospital," he said. His voice sounded weird, but he chalked it up to misuse. "Great," the old man smiled at him. "And what's your name?" "Dazai Osemu," he said while he looked around. He was in a small room. It looked like they might still be in the emergency rooms, which meant he wouldn't have been out for long. "How old are you?" 17, he answered absent-mindedly, but snapped his attention to the doctor, who didn't react as expected. He stilled for a moment, looked at the nurse with worry. Dazai said something wrong. Something was clearly very wrong. "You have a wound on your head," Yato said. "It seems it might have messed a bit with your memories. I will have to do a few more tests." Yato looked at the nurse. "Take him to the CT and start the cognitive testing." Yato smiled at Dazai, then, "Don't worry, we'll figure out what's happening." Dazai nodded curtly as the doctor left. "What year is it?" When she told him, the math was made in his mind within a second. He was supposed to be 24. If this was real and not a test, he was supposed to be 7 years older. The thought made him nauseous. He didn't think he would ever make it past 18. How did he make it to 24? The nurse pitied him. He hated looking at her. They tested his brain for a few hours, made sure everything was as it should. Which it was, the only problem being that he had lost 7 years of his life. He was allowed to walk around then. They made sure there was no damage to his spine and that the wound on his head wasn't too deep, which meant he could finally look through his things. It seemed all he had was a beige coat. It was the complete opposite of what he was used to wearing. It was long and warm and had more pockets than he probably needed. He found hidden pockets for random trinkets and items, not all of them useful. The phone was ignored. He didn't want to know if this was all real. He wasn't sure what he would do. But the doctors let him free. It didn't seem like he was trapped. It didn't seem like a test. His face was older, a bit skinnier but not in an unhealthy way like his 17-year-old self. His ribs weren't as visible, his hair looked like it was taken care of. Both his eyes looked back as he inspected himself. It was boring. He looked boring, but it did prove that the doctors weren't lying. He asked the nurse for extra bandages as she went to call his supposed workplace. That he would have a workplace as an emergency contact was ridiculous. This would never happen in the Mafia. Kenji was a child, he noted. He was filled with energy and happiness. Dazai wanted to break him. "Did you hurt your eye?" Kenji asked. Dazai didn't reach for the bandages covering his eye, but he wanted to. Kenji seemed genuine enough. He was really asking, which simply meant Dazai didn't cover his eye anymore. He shrugged. "No, it's all right now." He pulled it away and dropped the bandages into the trash as they walked out of the hospital. It felt weird walking, as if his legs were slightly too long, slightly out of place. He did his best to get used to it quickly. He couldn't let something like his new body be a hindrance. If he needed to fight anyone, he would need to be able to move normally. It didn't take him long before his hand-eye coordination was back where it should be, and he could put his legs exactly where he wanted. The agency building looked old and run down. It looked cheap and mistreated. He followed Kenji up the stairs and into an open area of desks and people. It only took a second for everyone to see him. In that second he had already taken stock of the whole room. There were a lot of kids that would be his own age. Most of them looked unassuming, except for a girl in a kimono with dark eyes. There was a blond man with a ponytail whose head snapped towards him automatically. He looked annoyed. There was a man probably in his 30s sucking on a lollipop, looking bored. He wore boring brown clothes, but when their eyes met they were far from boring. "Dazai!" the blonde called. Why was he angry already? He didn't care to find out. "This better not be another one of your pranks." He stomped up to Dazai, went to grab the lapels on his shirt. He easily dodged under the hands and walked up to the old man. He stopped in front of the desk, waited for a second as the detective slowly put on his pair of glasses. "Dazai Osamu," he presented himself when he had his full attention. He heard the blonde screech behind him, but still left them alone. "Edogawa Rampo," the man smiled. Dazai inspected him again. He was smart. His eyes understood exactly what was going on. "I have questions." "So do I." That was fair. Whatever had happened to Dazai must have been strange enough that no one here could understand it. Or maybe they were all just stupid. "How old am I?" Dazai asked. A huge smile spread over the detective's lips. "You're 17. Who am I?" Dazai's eyes flit over to the other again. He was childish, but over 30. He didn't have an ability related to smarts like he made it seem. Rampo had known exactly what had been happening since Dazai stepped foot into the room. The glasses were just for show. His feet had been on the desk until Dazai came up to it. He slacked off while the others worked diligently. He wasn't afraid of any repercussions. The answer was simple. "The greatest detective in the world." "That's right," Rampo grinned. "Where do I work?" Rampo looked a little disappointed. "That's too easy, Mr. Youngest Executive of the Port Mafia," he pouted. "Old you works here, at the Armed Detective Agency." Dazai looked at the things on his desk. There were mostly candy wrappers and novels, a few pens spread out, some empty notebooks. "And?" Dazai asked. That wasn't close to enough information. "Nope," Rampo tutted. "My turn." He gave him a deadpan look. "Really?" It made Rampo snort. A woman walked out of the door behind Rampo, looking Dazai over quickly before taking a seat in a free chair at the edge of his desk. "Who is everyone here?" Dazai rolled his eyes. This was a stupid question. He looked at the woman with the butterfly pin first. "Doctor," he said. He turned to his right and saw a boy with uneven white hair. He looked worried about the scrutiny but kept his back straight, refusing to let Dazai scare him. It was almost cute, but he looked at Dazai with admiration. "Some sort of protégé?" It came out as a question. The boy nodded quietly. "My name is Atsushi." Dazai shrugged and turned to the blonde ponytail behind him. He skipped over Kenji because that was honestly too obvious. The blonde walked up to him with something like interest in his eyes. He believed him now. Dazai looked him over. They would be the same age, and he had acted overly familiar with him. "Partner," he said simply, and turned to the girl with the dark eyes. "Mafia." "That's all." He looked back at Rampo, whose eyes were glittering. "Your turn," Rampo answered. "When did I last kill someone?" Rampo was surprised at the question, but answered nonetheless. 187 days ago." Dazai nodded. So he hadn't completely stopped like Kodasaku. It made him wonder why he would have left the Mafia at all if not for him. "What's your favourite book?" Was he trying to compare old Dazai to young Dazai? Why would he ask that? He had understood since long that they all expected him to act like some way which he didn't. He wondered if that could have something to do with it. The detective would know if he lied, so he didn't think he could. The flowers of buffoonery. "Okay," Rampo said, and didn't explain why he wanted to know. The doctor was easier to read. She looked both confused and exasperated, as if Rampo's antics were normal. It annoyed Dazai that he didn't understand why he wanted to know, but he didn't want to waste his question on something like that. "Why am I here?" "Your friend's dying wish was for you to be on the good side." "Oda?" It made the breath catch in his throat. Rampo nodded. "What's your sexuality?" He almost got a whiplash from the turn of topic. "Gay." The doctor's eyes widened. Atsushi gasped. The blonde behind him froze. Dazai didn't think. He grabbed the gun from the blonde's belt and pen from Rampo's desk. Before anyone could react, the gun was pointed at Rampo and the pen an inch away from the blonde's eye. He stood with one arm stretched towards both of them, glaring at Rampo. "Why did you ask that?" he asked darkly. No one had known. Rampo had wanted to out him for some reason. "Fun," the detective said. The safety clicked and his finger laid on the trigger. "Blondie," he said darkly, but didn't turn his head to look at the man at the edge of his pencil. A door opened and an old man stood in the doorway. He didn't look away from Rampo as he spoke to the blonde. "I am well aware you're good at MMA, but there is no world in which you could get me down before I shoot. Don't try." He studied Rampo still. No one knew. There were a few reasons as to why that would be, but Dazai couldn't think of anything that made sense unless he was protecting someone else. But the only person he would ever try to protect. "Stand down, Kunikida," the old man at the door said. Dazai ignored them. He watched as Rampo's eyes flickered over him. Even if he was protecting someone, it wouldn't make sense for Rampo to out him. Rampo would know. "What you're thinking is correct," Rampo said, "with a slight correction. You want to tell people." So old Dazai was dating someone. That's ridiculous. What's even more ridiculous is that he would be around people who want to tell things like that. In 100 years he didn't think he could ever. "I have a theory," Dazai said. Rampo's eyes widened and he yelled out, but he wouldn't be fast enough. Before he could even stand up, Dazai had turned the gun on himself. He placed it under his chin and pulled the trigger. He didn't die. The gun didn't even go off. He looked down at the two parts of the gun, now cleanly sliced in half and lying on the floor. He pouted. He had thought this would happen, but he would have rather died. The old man is sheathing his blade back into the hilt. Dazai hadn't even seen it move. Dazai had proven in less than 5 minutes that these people clearly knew him and would try to protect him. It was concerning that they cared so much for him. "You idiot!" Kunikida hissed and went to grab the hand threatening his eye. Dazai swirled the pen back and put it down on the desk before Kunikida had even raised his own hand. Dazai bothered giving him a bored look. "I already told you." "Dazai-kun," the old man said, and opened up the door he came out of previously. It was an invitation. That must be the president then. Dazai simply shrugged and stepped over the gun to follow the president into the next room. "Dazai," Rampo called out before he stepped through the door, "if you don't find him, he'll find you, and older you will lose out on the experience." He nodded and followed the president. He'd figure out all of that later. "What did the doctors say about your condition?" The president showed him to a group of couches. He took a seat opposite of him. "That I might not ever get my memories back." That sounded negative, but I probably would. The president nodded. "We are not comfortable with giving you time off," he said. "Not because you're forced to work here, but because I'm going to kill myself. Yes, I've gotten that." He looked around the room. It was boring, green, old. "We care about you, all of us." He snapped his eyes back to the man, tried to find a lie, but there was none. How stupid of them. "So you want to give me a babysitter?" "That's not how I would, but that's what it is." The president gave him an icy stare, probably unhappy at being interrupted. An image crossed his mind of the president being angry. Could he get him angry enough to hurt him? "I have to find someone," Dazai said with a bored tone. "Who do you want me to stay with?" "I was thinking Kunikida-kun." "Absolutely not." The president raised an eyebrow. "That's the most his expression has changed all this time." "Then who do you have in mind?" He wanted to say Rampo, only so he could ask more questions, but he knew Rampo wasn't mature enough to care for someone else. "The doctor," he said instead. "Very well." He didn't let anything show on his face. "I will make sure she's okay with it. Can you come back here by 7 p.m.? Dazai looked at the clock. That would be in 6 hours. "Sure." He stood then. He did believe these people. No one had been lying to him so far. But he wasn't sure if he would be back. The president gave him a nod and he was dismissed. Dazai walked straight out of the agency, not caring for his partner's questions. He thought about what Rampo had said. If you don't find him, he'll find you, and older you will lose out on the experience. He made it sound as if it was something older Dazai wanted, like something Dazai had looked forward to being a part of. He wondered if it was only to mess with his partner. He looked like someone who would blow up over nothing, much like Chuuya. Would Chuuya still be talking to him? That was ridiculous. Rampo expected him to find the person he was dating without knowing anything about his grown-up self. It had to be someone he knew. Logically, it would be the only person Dazai had ever loved like that. But that should be impossible. Dazai had a 10-year plan. It's only been 7. And don't forget, he had left the Mafia and the fact that he didn't think he'd survive this long. It shouldn't be possible. He found the phone that was hidden in the beige coat he was forced to wear. Not that anyone forced it onto him, but because he couldn't let people know he wasn't himself. He looked at the phone, stared at the black screen. If this opens with the same password, he decided, if it opens with Chuuya's birthday, he would find him. He glared at the screen for another few seconds before putting in the passcode. It opened instantly. It gave him pause. 7 years. How could he look at a Chuuya that was 7 years older than him? He wouldn't remember everything Chuuya did. He looked around the street he was walking along. He wasn't sure where he was or where he was going. He had just walked. But he had his phone. He scrolled through it until he found a contact of slug emojis. He had pressed the call button before it even registered in his mind. Mackerel? Chuuya's voice was deeper, if that was even possible. He wasn't instantly angry that Dazai called. He hated it. This wasn't right. It was one thing to meet people he'd never seen before, but Chuuya sounding older made everything too real. "Can you find me?" he asked eventually. He thought his voice might sound more dead than normal. It made Chuuya pause. "Always," he said eventually, and the line clicked. He pocketed the phone and looked at the street sign. He wondered how Chuuya would find him, but his dog had always been pretty good at that. He waited almost 10 minutes. He started getting impatient when a car pulled up next to him. He jumped in without checking who the driver was. Chuuya pulled away instantly, drove down the road, and turned onto another one. "What's happening?" he asked. Dazai inspected the other. He wasn't necessarily taller, but he was bigger. He had filled out. His face wasn't as round. He looked a lot older than he did the last time Dazai saw him. He looked like an actual adult, and it made Dazai shudder. He hated it, truly. When they stopped at the red light, Chuuya looked him over. Dazai recognized that look. He was searching for any injuries. "Dazai," he said, commanded. "Tell me." Those blue eyes were piercing his. Then his eyes turned confused. He looked Dazai over again, but now he was looking for something else. "I hit my head," he explained. Chuuya wasn't worried, but he was something. He was confused and a little afraid. "You're acting like—" He turned his eyes back on the road, kept driving. Dazai didn't answer, didn't affirm or deny his suspicions. They drove through town. Chuuya didn't question him further. He accepted they wouldn't speak until they weren't in the car anymore. They had learnt early to never tell secrets in cars. They weren't safe. Chuuya was wearing dark clothes, blacks and greys and browns. He was clearly still in the Mafia, still wearing that ridiculous hat. Eventually they stopped in front of a building. Chuuya led the way upstairs and into an elevator. Chuuya was inspecting him from the side but didn't say anything. When the elevator stopped, he showed him to an apartment. Chuuya unlocked it and held the door open for him. Dazai kicked off his shoes and dropped the coat onto the floor where it belonged. "Hey!" Chuuya complained, but picked the coat up instead of berating him further. He really had grown up. Dazai walked into the living room, saw 3 bookshelves next to each other filled with books. He walked over to it, looked at the different titles. He saw the book quickly, The Flowers of Buffoonery, the one Rampo had asked about. He understood now why he had brought it up, so there would be no doubt in Dazai's mind about him and Chuuya. "Do we live together?" he asked and turned to Chuuya, who was watching him. "How many years?" Chuuya asked. He almost looked sad, but his eyes were steeled, as if he couldn't trust Dazai with his thoughts. He wondered if he was the same as a 24-year-old. "I'm 17, Dazai answered and motioned toward him in return. "Yes, we do." Dazai nodded and looked back at the books. There must have been hundreds. He didn't know most of them. At least he could find something to do. "The president wants someone to babysit me," he said. "I'm only here because Rampo told me to." Chuuya walked towards him, stopped next to the bookshelf next to him. "Why?" he asked. Dazai met his eyes for a second to understand the actual question. "I hit my head, or someone hit me," he shrugged. "The doctor said it would probably come back. Maybe not." Chuuya took a slow breath. 7 years ago he would have started yelling already. He would have been angry at Dazai for being stupid enough to get hit, for leaving him to remember things for the both of them. Dazai had no doubt Chuuya still felt these things. Maybe he was just better at masking them. "I need a drink," he muttered and walked away, into what would be the kitchen. Dazai could admit he was a bit curious. How had he managed to get Chuuya to live with him? They were supposed to hate each other. He walked after the other into the kitchen, saw Chuuya uncork a bottle of wine with visibility and pour it into a glass. "Why are we living together?" Chuuya swirled the wine, gave him a deadpan look. "Why do people live together?" "Do you like me?" "Do you?" Chuuya glared at him. He then closed his eyes and turned his head away. "Sorry, you can ask whatever the fuck you want. Go ahead." Dazai opened his mouth and closed it again. Their relationship was never like this. Whatever they did was always a transaction. It had to be even. If one wanted something, the other needed something in return. They didn't give things freely. Dazai wanted to test it. He needed to. Something like power coursed through his veins. Chuuya never gave him anything for free. "What do you think of the doctor?" Chuuya turned towards him again. He leaned against the kitchen island and Dazai took a seat on the other side. "She's cool," he said eventually. "Very expensive taste in everything, which is sad considering your guys' salaries." "So you know her?" "We've only talked during missions," he said. "But I don't distrust her, if that's what you're getting at." Dazai shrugged. "Babysitting duties," he explained. "Is Mori alive?" "Yeah." He made a face. "And we're dating?" "As if I'd let Mori do anything to either one of us." That gave Dazai pause. Younger Chuuya, his Chuuya, worshipped the ground he walked on. This Chuuya sounded like he'd get into a fist fight with Mori over him. Dazai tilted his head, watched as Chuuya took a sip. His hair was shorter than it used to be. It was still uneven, but not as obviously. "What's my favourite book?" "The Bell Jar." Dazai would have to read that. It felt unfair that for once he knew so little. Usually Chuuya would be the one who had to catch up. "Why can't I stay here?" He knew the answer already. He just wanted someone else to say it. "Because they don't know we're together. I'm guessing they don't trust you to not kill yourself, which," Chuuya nodded to himself, "is totally fucking fair." Dazai felt as if he was out of his depth. Chuuya was so calm. He was so far from the explosive teenager he knew. It didn't seem like no matter what he asked he'd have the upper hand. It was strange. He hated it. Blue eyes pierced into his then. Chuuya leaned an arm over the island, watching Dazai closely. He wondered how good Chuuya would be at reading him. Would things have changed after all these years? Would it be different because he wasn't 17 anymore? "I tried to kill myself today," Dazai admitted, just to see the flash of hurt in Chuuya's eyes. "Sadly, didn't succeed." Chuuya didn't comment, but his eyes grew a little softer, almost nostalgic, as if living in a memory. "If you ever want to kill yourself again, you call me. As you saw today, I will drop anything for you." And Dazai did believe him. He didn't fully understand it, but he didn't doubt it. Dazai didn't think he would kill himself. Not in a while. Everything that's happening right now was interesting. It made him want to find out everything he possibly could. When he did, he probably would kill himself. But first he needed to know everything. "I happen to know you liked me at 17, Chuuya said then. He straightened up and took a sip of his wine. He looked smug. He wanted to wipe that grin off his face. "I happen to know you had a 10-year plan." He placed the glass next to him on the counter, grinned. "Do you want to know what happened?" Dazai looked between the glass and Chuuya, saw his confidence and wanted to drown it. Dazai nodded. Chuuya placed both hands on the island between them, leaned forward to meet Dazai's eyes head on. "I happened," he said darkly with a large grin. "You're an idiot if you think I would ever wait for you. Don't you know me better than that?" He forgot to breathe for a second or a few. "I do." He opened his mouth to say something more, but nothing came out. Chuuya's grin turned feral. "And?" he pushed. He didn't know what to answer. His eyes widened slightly. He had never not known what to say to someone. There was no way in which he could get out of this on top. Chuuya had cornered him so easily, just to prove he could. "I hate you," he whispered. Chuuya laughed out loud and leaned back. His eyes turned soft again, warm and calm and pretty. Dazai hated him. He really did. You better get your memory back, Chuuya said. I went through a lot to get us here. Is that why Chuuya is day drinking? Nah, I took the day off to take care of you, so might as well, right? Dazai leaned back, studied his chibi. Where's my drink? You're 17. Chew, he deadpanned. Even if his body hadn't been 24, he had still been drinking since he was 15. Fine, he muttered, and put down a tumbler in front of him. He didn't even ask what he wanted. Just poured some amber liquid on top of an ice cube. Did Chuuya always know him this well? How did we get together? He looked at the whiskey in his glass. It reminded him of Udaseku. A few days ago he had been drinking with them, and today he was dead. His feelings felt disconnected from his mind. It didn't feel real. He hadn't seen it happen. Is that what you want to know? Chuuya knows me too well. Chuuya's hip was leaning against the island. He casually drank from his wine as he watched him. I can tell you if you want to know. I do. Chuuya nodded. Well, once upon a time I defeated a dragon, turned into a vampire, and almost died at least 3 more times, he said. After all that, I got tired of waiting for you to make any useful plans and took it into my own hands. Dazai had so many questions. I showed up at your dorm, told you I wasn't going to wait forever, then kissed you until you started crying. I would never! Dazai exclaimed, completely offended. Oh, trust me, you would. Several times. He closed his mouth with a pout, took a sip instead of looking at the chibi. The liquid was warm, spicy and good. Don't think too much about it, Chuuya smiled. It was a mess in other ways. Neither of us ever knew how to thread things like love. Dazai pouted slightly. Then what? Then we argued and fought, and oh my god, the amount of times we had to learn how to talk to each other. Chuuya was smiling to himself. Communication is difficult when it comes to important things, but nowadays I'd say we're pretty good at it. Because you would drop everything to pick me up. I would. Dazai met his eyes, saw the smile and the warmth. He wanted something like this. He wanted his memories back. I can ditch the agency, he said. Rampo will know I'm with you. And what will he say, that you're with your boyfriend? Dazai shrugged. He knew he couldn't. Rampo had told him not to. Because his older self, with all the memories, wanted to. Sweetheart, Chuuya smiled with his eyes. You're too young to make decisions like these. I'm smarter than every person in this city, and yet you still don't understand. I do understand, it's just stupid. That's not what matters. Chuuya was stupid, he decided. Why would he be on Rampo's side? Why would he care at what age Dazai was, when he experienced things? You won't feel the same things now as you would in 7 years, Chuuya explained. You wouldn't appreciate it in the same way or understand it. He smiled softly at Dazai. I'm not saying you're stupid. I'm saying the older you learned how to want things along the way. He took a drink from the whiskey. It didn't seem plausible, but he could tell Chuuya wasn't lying. Do you still have the Xbox? Chuuya's grin turned feral again. They spent the next few hours drinking and playing video games.